Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. I must say, I didn't know much about Tenovus, because not living in Wales, working in Wales, I'm not eligible for a grant. So, but I mean, it's just an extraordinary organisation. It really is. I mean, from the cutting edge sort of genomics and epigenetics to you know, obviously the choir, which is not only an amazing fundraiser, but actually therapeutic. I mean, spectacular. When I first went to work with Richard Doll in 1974, the first randomized trial I worked on was actually a trial of inoperable lung cancer. It was quite funny, the slide that Gordon showed, because we randomized people between 3 treatments. I mean, it was palliative therapy, cyclophosphamide as a single agent, and a ghastly 4-drug combination, including nitrogen mustard and cyclophosphamide and 2 other horrible things. And there were 2 interesting things about the trial. The first was the randomization process. I mean, I produced a random list of A's and B's and C's, and so when the next patient came in, the doctor sort of softly looked down to see it was A, B, or C. And then he said to the patients, we're not sure how to cure, how to treat lung cancer when it can't be operated on, and that we're trying various different things, and we've decided to give you this. That was informed consent. I mean, the patient didn't sign anything, and they weren't told that they'd been randomized. So things have changed quite a lot in 40 years. But the results of the trial were quite interesting, because the group that got palliative therapy, that got no cytotoxic drugs, did significantly better than the others. The single agent did next best, and the 4-drug combination did the worst. So when we published that in the Lancet, it went down like a lead balloon with the oncologist. Anyway, that's by the way. Where's the button? Well, here's your grandfather, and the other 9 of them, how do you say it? It's not such a good name as 10 of us. Quite a lot's happened since 1943, and Gordon's described it fairly well. What I want to talk about is very old-fashioned epidemiology. I'm going to go through basically 40 years of asbestos epidemiology to see what's happened and what hasn't happened, and to give us some idea of what might happen in the future. Not everybody realizes that mesothelioma has crept up on us. I mean, there are now 2,400 deaths a year in Britain, which is 3 times as many as there are deaths from cervical cancer, and 1/5 as many as there are from breast cancer. I mean, it really is a very common cancer. It's gone from being so rare people doubted if it existed to being a major killer, and it's still increasing, and we know why. And it's not only in Britain. I mean, this graph shows the mesothelioma rates in different countries in the world, and I mean these are male rates horizontally and female rates vertically. They're not on the same scale. So the maximum, there's a cumulative death rate up to age 85. So this corresponds to almost 1%. I mean, almost 1% of male deaths in my generation, people born in the 40s, are going to die of mesothelioma. It's extraordinary. That's how common it is. And it's about 6 times rarer in women. But as you can say, the UK and Australia have got the world record. I mean, Britain's got the highest mesothelioma rate in the world, and my generation have got the highest mesothelioma rate in Britain. A dubious privilege. About 30 years ago, I got hold of the data of Erwin Selikoff, was an amazing old, slightly scientifically dubious pathologist, but he did a wonderful job. He studied the mesothelioma rates in American insulation workers, and he gave me his data. And when you plot them like this, they show something very interesting. There were 2 interesting things about this slide. I mean, one is that the mesothelioma rate is virtually 0 for 30 years after you're exposed, and then it goes up like a rocket. So I mean, you're always 30 or 40 years behind the curve when you're looking at mesothelioma. I mean, I'll come on to this, but I mean, we have no idea what the mesothelioma rates are going to be as a result of what's happening now, because the only way of finding out is to wait 30 years. Well, there was one other way, which I'll come on to. But the other thing that's interesting about it is that age has absolutely no effect on it. It's interesting theoretically. If you look at the left-hand graph, this is plotted against age. And these are people who are first... sorry, I tried to clean this slide up and I deleted the box. The blue line is people who were exposed from age 20. The red line is people exposed from age 30. And the green line is people who started being exposed at age 40. And what you see is if you're exposed from age 20, you finish up with a lifetime risk of almost 20% with that exposure. If you're first exposed at age 40, you die before you have time to get mesothelioma. But on the right-hand graph, they're plotted against years since starting exposure, and the curves are all exactly the same. So age has nothing to do with the risk at all. The risk is entirely determined by how long it is since you were first exposed to asbestos. And the same is true of lung cancer in smokers. It's also true of mice dipped in benzpyrene. I mean, the potent carcinogens seem to operate completely independently of natural processes. I mean, the process starts when you begin exposure, and it's only the passage of time that determines the risk. So old people don't get cancer because they're old. They get cancer because the carcinogenic processes have been going on longer in their cells. Well, until 20 years ago, the early 90s, people thought basically that, I mean, we'd stopped using asbestos in about 1980. Mesothelioma was still pretty rare, and people thought that, you know, it would come and go, and that would be that. I mean, people hadn't really appreciated the scale of the problem. And I discovered it completely by accident. It was Richard Doll's 80th birthday party at the Royal Society, and all the people who worked with him for a long time were invited to come and give little talks on what they'd been doing. So they asked me to come and talk for half an hour about asbestos, and I couldn't think of anything interesting to say. So I knew the health and safety executive kept a register of mesotheliomas, but they weren't published. And I rang up and said, could I have them? And they sent them by return post. I got this single piece of paper with the death rates by age and year. And when you plot them like this, what this graph shows is the death rate. These are data up to 1991, which is what they sent me though. What you see is each line is people born in a different year. So the little orange line on the right is people born in 1891. These are British men. And on the left, the orange line here is British men born in 1966. And there are two things about that graph which are blindingly obvious as soon as you plot it. The first is that they're all the same shape. And the second is that each generation has a higher risk than the previous generation, that the rate is just going up and up and up for any particular, this is age. I mean, each generation has got a higher mesothelioma rate than the previous generation. And it's very easy, just a statistical manipulation, to work out what that means and what's going to happen in the future. And so we published this paper, and not surprisingly, it got quite a lot of attention because, I mean, at that time, there were about 1,000 mesothelioma deaths a year, and it was completely clear that it was going to go up to well over 2,000. And, I mean, that's now happened, and that's the situation we're now in, sort of 18 years later. And in the same year, 1995, that we published that, the Health and Safety Executive had, in 1970, it started a study where they enrolled all the people who were in industries that were covered by the asbestos industry regulations, about 50,000 of them. The cohort was expanded later. And they followed them up to 1990, and they just happened to publish the results at the same time. And they show an extraordinary thing. I mean, in that huge cohort, which as far as they were concerned was the entire exposed population, these were all the men that worked in factories that were covered by the regulations, that were being you know, monitored by the Health and Safety Executive, or used to be the old factory inspectorate. And during those 20 years, there were 170 mesothelioma deaths. Now, during those 20 years, there were more than 10,000 mesothelioma deaths in British men. So what they thought was the entire problem was less than 2% of the problem. Literally, I mean, the other 98% of mesotheliomas were people who didn't work in those factories. I mean, we know now that they were builders and shipbuilders and plumbers and carpenters and so on, particularly carpenters, actually. But the scale of the error was 50-fold. I mean, what they thought was the whole problem was a 50th of the problem. And so, I mean, following that, we decided we ought to do a big national case control study to find out what people were actually doing, and we found out what the jobs were that these other 98% of mesotheliomas had caused them. And we published a report on the first 600 cases about 4 years ago. And there were two major conclusions. I mean, first of all, there were some extraordinary risks. I mean, all carpenters my age, we're talking essentially about people born between 1935 and 1955, and that's the people we were studying. 6% of all British carpenters my age are going to die of mesothelioma. It's extraordinary. I mean, that's of all carpenters in Britain. I mean, obviously some of them are much higher risk than others because they didn't all do the same thing. But the reason for it is amosite board. I mean, that asbestos board, which they sawed up, which everybody had and probably still has got, sort of boxing in their pipes and panels for fire doors and so on and so forth. And this was being sawn up with power tools indoors with the windows shut 9 months a year in England. At the same time as the factories, the health and safety executives were carefully going around factories to find out whether they were conforming to the 1 fibre per cc hygiene standard. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's very, very hard to understand how such a, I mean, the cosmic oversight of it was just amazing, because it was known that asbestos was carcinogenic. I mean, Richard Dodd proved that in 1955, that people thought they'd solved the problem by sticking ventilation in the factories. But the other interesting thing that came out of it was the majority of female cases aren't occupational. Nearly all the male cases are, and sort of 85% of the male cases are linked to one of these high-risk jobs. But over 60% of the female cases aren't. About 20% of them were occupational. About 20% were in women who lived with a man who was bringing asbestos dust home in his clothes. But 60% were simply spread across social classes and across jobs, and doctors and office workers were at the same risk as everybody else. And so it became clear that there was actually very substantial occupational exposure, I mean, environmental exposure, which affected the whole population, men and women. And of course, more or less the same risk in men and women. And that would correspond to something like, of the order of 200 or 300 deaths a year in each sex. I mean, it's a really substantial fraction. I mean, it's a small fraction of the 2,000 cases in men, but it's a large fraction of the 400 cases in women. We've carried on with those studies. We've now interviewed 1,400 mesotheliomas and 1,400 lung cancers and 1,400 controls. But we've also interviewed 800 pneumothorax patients. Now, pneumothorax, having a collapsed lung, has got nothing to do with asbestos. But it's the one group of people where you can actually interview normal human beings and people who aren't ill, because they're cured. I mean, they're operated and they're right as rain and die at the age of 95. But when they operate, they keep 2 or 3 cc's of lung, and so you can get a lung sample from them. That's extremely useful, because you can find out how much asbestos there is in it. And so we've been collecting lung samples. We collected lung samples from the mesotheliomas after they died. We interviewed them, and then we flagged them, obviously with informed consent, and when they died, we got a lung sample. The lung cancers were all resected lung cancers, so there was already a sample of lung available. And for the pneumothorax as well, we got lung samples to analyse what was in their lungs. We also updated the projections of what was going to happen. It's gone down a bit. The prediction of the peak has gone down from 2,700 to about 2,300, which will be in about 10 years' time. The reasons for that are, well, I mean, it's probably a diagnostic trend. It's still increasing rapidly, but not quite as rapidly as it was before. But anyway, the predictions were essentially correct. But the thing about this graph is that it has to be calculated assuming there was no asbestos exposure in men born after 1970. Not because there wasn't any, but because we've got absolutely no information about it. I mean, the trends in mortality give us this information, but people born after 1970 don't yet have measurable mesothelioma rates, even in the whole of Britain. I mean, there's only a handful of cases aged under 40 every year in the whole country, so there aren't enough data to analyse. So all we know is that those ghastly working conditions, which went on until about 1980, caused this mesothelioma epidemic, but we really don't know what happened after that, and that's obviously the only thing that matters from a practical point of view. I mean, should we be ripping asbestos out of schools, or monitoring it, or just ignoring it? I mean, that's the practical and very expensive question. And this is the same projection for America. And this is quite interesting, because the Americans actually, I mean, they're slightly closer to the peak than us, but I mean, they're more or less at the peak now. But they're similar. But the interesting thing is the peak number of cases in America is just over 2,000. And the peak number of cases in Britain is going to be just over 2,000. But of course, America is 6 times bigger than England. They've got 6 times the population. So why is this? 5 times, actually. I mean, 60 million, 300 million. So why is the mesothelioma rate 5 times lower in America than it is in England? Well, Incidentally, I mean, we did the same thing for various different countries around the world, and it's a fairly impressive total. I mean, there are going to be a lot of mesothelioma deaths by 2050. Now, what this table shows is the death rates by age in England and America, and I'd just like to point out that men born in 1950, men born in 1950 were at age 50 to 54. In 2000 to 2004, which is what these are the WHO data of that period. And the UK rate is 4.5 times higher than the American rate. I mean, so why is this? I mean, it's an extraordinary discrepancy. When you look at the amount of asbestos that was used in the UK, the top line is chrysotile, white asbestos, and the brown one is amosite, brown asbestos. And the blue one is crasidolite, which is blue asbestos, which was well known to be the worst sort. I mean, it was banned in 1970. I mean, the mesothelioma risk was so high that it was recognized very early on. All the South African crasidolite miners were dying of mesothelioma, and so it was banned. But they went on using amosite, and amosite fell through the cracks. Everyone knows about blue asbestos and white asbestos, but people don't know about brown asbestos. But a lot of it was used in Britain, and it was used particularly in those building boards, insulating boards which the carpenters were sawing up. And when you look at the American graph, the use of chrysotile per head in America was almost exactly the same as it was in Britain. I mean, it's 5 times more. It's 700,000 or 800,000 tons a year, whereas we're using 150,000 tons a year. But of course, there's 5 times as many of them, so the consumption per head was the same. But the huge difference is the use of amosite. They went on using crasidolite. We stopped using crasidolite in 1970. But the Americans, they went on using crasidolite. They used the same amount of chrysotile as us, but they used tiny amounts of amosite, just because they didn't use it in building. The interesting thing about America and amosite is that the one group which had the huge mesothelioma rates, which was the first slide I showed, the American insulators, they were the one working group in America that did use amosite. They sprayed it on steel buildings. And we know that for certain, because when you look in their lungs, you find nothing but amosite in them. And so the importance of amosite in relation to the mesothelioma epidemic is something which really hadn't been appreciated. And when you look in the lungs of the mesotheliomas that we collected, you can see that the dominant type is amosite. That's the brown one. And there were tiny amounts of chrysotile, white asbestos, but that doesn't mean they weren't exposed to it. Chrysotile is eliminated from the lung. It dissolves and disappears after a few months, and so you don't get any information about what the effects of chrysotile are from these studies. What you see is the crasidolite and the amosite which stay there. But you can see the dominant fibre in British mesotheliomas is amosite. Now, when you look in more detail at the trends, you see, in men, you see more or less what you'd expect to see. These are years from 1970 up to the latest period, 2005 to 2009. Mesothelioma death rates. And the top line is men aged over 65. And these are still shooting up. They won't shoot up much further because the top point, I put a little arrow there, those are men born before 1940. The green line, the last dot, is men born in 1947. I mean, they're aged about 60 in 2007. So they're men born in 1947. And the very bottom line is men born in 1967. They're aged about 40 in 2007. And you can see the numbers are absolutely minute. So we've got no actual data in terms of death rates for people born after about 1970. I mean, you can see why. But anyway, you can also see that below age 50, the rates are dropping quite sharply. There's a real sharp decline. Below the age of 50, mesothelioma rates are going down. And the reason for that is because people born in 1950 had less exposure than people born in 1940, and people born in 1960 had less exposure than them. So that's what you'd expect. When you look at the female rates, you see something rather worrying. The general pattern looks the same, but when you look at the bottom, it's flat. In the last 20 years, there's been no decline at all in female rates. And of course, the reason for that is because they're caused by environmental asbestos exposure. And if exposure stopped in 1980, you had to be born before 1960 be working in 1980. And so the people born after 1960 had much lower risks and much lower exposure. But of course, as far as environmental exposure goes, that's not true. We know from that first graph I showed that the really big risk comes from being exposed to asbestos when you're young. And if being exposed when you're 20 is worse than being exposed when you're 40, being exposed when you're 5 is obviously a lot worse than being exposed when you're 20. So anybody born in 1975 would have lived the first 5 years of their lives in an environment where environmental asbestos levels were as high as they'd ever been. And I think that that's the explanation. I mean, as I say, I mean, it's too early to say how long this will go on for and when it will finally drop. But that constant rate in young women is consistent with what we saw in our case control studies. I mean, these cases aren't caused by occupation, they're caused by asbestos in the environment, whatever that means. Now, the environment might be walking past a building site, it might be the ironing board, or it might be school. I mean, schools were all schools, or very high proportion of schools, were built with asbestos materials. There were studies done in the early 80s that showed there were measurable amounts of asbestos in the air of the schools. And everybody goes to school for 10 years, from sort of 5 to 15. And so it's quite plausible to suggest that a really substantial fraction of the mesotheliomas in women, and a similar number in men, but a smaller proportion, were actually caused by asbestos in schools up to the end of the 1970s. Now, how do we find out what's happened to asbestos levels since 1980? We've seen, I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but I mean, the graph I showed of asbestos consumption. Is it gone? There. Oh, there, here we are. I mean, asbestos use was peaking in the late 1970s and then dropped incredibly rapidly. By 1980, it dropped enormously. By 1990, it virtually ceased. So, I mean, after 1980, asbestos consumption dropped dramatically. Sorry? 5 minutes. I don't think I'm being given quite the same latitude that Gordon was. Well, to cut a long story short, we've looked at their lungs. And so, first of all, these are lung burdens, asbestos lung burdens, and the fibres are mainly amosite, and most of the rest are crucidolite, as I said. Now, the levels are much higher in mesotheliomas than they are in the lung cancers or the pneumothorax patients. But if you look at pneumothorax patients born before and after 1965, the two right-hand columns, you can see that levels are much, much lower in people born after 1965, not surprisingly. And if you look at the dose response, I mean, comparing the mesothelioma levels with the lung cancer levels, you get this curve which starts off going in a straight line. And a plausible explanation for why the curve bends over is because asbestos also causes lung cancer. And so when you get to the high levels, you're dividing by the lung cancer rate, which is 1 plus some function of the dose. And in fact, you can estimate both the lung cancer dose response and the mesothelioma dose response. And interestingly, that dose response for lung cancer predicts that there'll be almost equal numbers of lung cancers and mesotheliomas in men. So if there are 2,000 mesotheliomas a year in men, there are also about 2,000 lung cancers caused by asbestos, which is 10% of all male lung cancers. So 1 in 10 lung cancers that are happening now are caused by asbestos. Now, when you look at the pneumothorax patients, who are essentially the general population by year of birth, you see a really striking decline. These are people born in the 1923 to 39, then people born in the 40s, the 50s, 65 to 74, and 75 to 85, the last group. And you can see that the lung burdens are just dropping dramatically over time. And when you plot that graph against the national mesothelioma rates, this heavy line is the death rate in men from mesothelioma up to the age of 50. Now, the reason it's only taken up to the age of 50 is because at the right-hand end of the curve, you're looking at people born in 1960 to 64, and you've only got their data up to age 50. So that you can look at them uniformly. For each year of birth, you've got death rates of mesothelioma in Britain up to that age. And this dotted line is the average level of asbestos that we found in their lungs. And the bottom ones are the same thing for women. I mean, a much shallower decline for the reasons I said in women. It's environmental and didn't drop in the same way that the occupational exposure dropped. And there were the lung burdens in women. And the one very reassuring thing, but based on extremely small numbers, is the very right-hand point. We haven't got any women yet, but we've got a few men who were born between 1975 and 85, and their average lung burden is 2,000 fibres per gram, compared with an average of 80,000 fibres per gram in men born in the 40s, my generation. And so there's a 40-fold reduction in the lung burdens. And that graph is reassuring. I mean, it does suggest that there ought to be a 40-fold reduction in the mesothelioma rate, but the trouble is we shan't know for another 20 years, because that's how long you have to wait to find out. And even that only relates to people born around 1980. And what we want to know now is what we should be doing about asbestos. And, I mean, it's obviously, I mean, it's a mistake to say that, you know, the mesothelioma rates we see today have anything to do with current exposure. They're to do with the, you know, 2 orders of magnitude higher exposure that took place and stopped in 1980. But at the same time, the levels aren't zero. Having 2,000 fibres per gram in your lung is quite a daunting thought. I mean, it's still quite a lot of fibres, even if the risk isn't as high as it used to be. And so this isn't really something I've got an opinion on. I mean, it's really not clear what ought to be done. I mean, I suspect that because we don't know what to do, we might do more harm than good by trying to do anything about it. It might be better to forget about it. But I mean, the risk is not zero, the exposure is not zero. I mean, Gary Burdett, who's doing our electron microscopy, published this paper in 1989, which was the asbestos levels in a big teaching block before and after an asbestos removal program. And the level before removal was 0.0001 fibres, I mean 0.1 fibres per litre of air. And it went up by orders of magnitude during removal. And when the building was reoccupied, it was considerably higher than it had been to start with. And funnily enough, the levels in the ambient air outside were slightly higher than they were in the building to start with. So the effect of removing asbestos from that building was actually to increase the exposure of the occupants. So it's not obvious that you want to throw money at a problem like this, because you might be killing people by doing it. It really is quite a difficult problem. And incidentally, I mean, I said we interviewed a lot of lung cancers as well. And when we look at them by occupation, the occupations that cause big mesothelioma risks, the conclusion is exactly the same as it is from that dose response, that the attributable fraction caused by asbestos is 10%. So 1 in 10 of lung cancers now occurring in British men are caused by asbestos. And just finally, at the end, I'd like to mention the fact that, I mean, this graph shows world consumption of asbestos. It went up to 4 million tonnes a year in about 1980. And then dropped dramatically when Western Europe stopped using it. And it's now 2 million tonnes a year. And it's 2 million tonnes a year because Russia and China and India and several other Southeast Asian countries are using, Kazakhstan actually, there's another, I mean, there are a lot of countries using very substantial amounts of asbestos. And this is a contemporary picture of an asbestos mine. I'm going to visit in 3 weeks, actually, because IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, in collaboration with the Russians, is setting up a cohort study of the men who worked in this chrysotile mine to find out what their cancer rates are, because there are no data at all in Russia. There's actually no information. And it's obviously of some interest. Now, the Russians are digging their heels in and saying white asbestos is much less dangerous than brown and blue, which is true. Therefore, there's no reason why they should ban it. Everybody is saying it's a moral outrage. Asbestos, we banned asbestos and you ought to. And politically, I'm not sure that that's very astute. I think talking scientific rubbish to the Russians isn't the way to deal with the problem. I think you've got to actually tell them, you've got to study the problem and tell them what the data are and let them decide for themselves. But anyway, we're trying to set this study up. When I say we, I'm on the advisory committee, but I'm not doing any work. I mean, the IARC and the Russians are doing the work. That just shows the tonnage. There's about millions of tons of asbestos used per year in 2008 by different countries. I mean, Russia, China, Brazil, Kazakhstan, Canada's gone down to 0. Oh, so this is world production. On the whole, the people who produce it use it as well, but Canada produced it, stopped using it a long time ago, went on producing and selling it to the Russians. But they've stopped doing it now. But it's an interesting, I don't know what people think about this. I mean, the same thing arises in some ways in relation to passive smoking. I mean, passive smoking is not harmless, and it's particularly not harmless for children, but it doesn't cause an enormous lung cancer risk in adults. But the fact that people think it does has actually has done more to reduce smoking than everything else put together. And so, I mean, there is a hazard, and it's quite reasonable to make a fuss about it. But I mean, in that sort of situation, you know, everybody knows we want to stop people smoking, because 50% of smokers die. And the fact that smoking is no longer publicly acceptable is the major reason for the massive decline in smoking that's taken place in the last 20 years. And so there's a reluctance among epidemiologists to get involved in studies on passive smoking. I mean, it's clearly bad for children. It causes a small cancer risk in adults. And we don't really care how big the risk is, because we're very glad it's been banned. And I don't know whether or not we're not to take the same attitude over the Russians and asbestos. I mean, what do you do in a situation where the scientific data are actually very poor? I mean, this shows you the sort of thing that goes on. This is an article that appeared in The Lancet a few years ago that apparently shows the correlation between mesothelioma rates internationally and the national consumption and annual consumption of asbestos. And it looks like a jolly good correlation. But if you look at the graph slightly more carefully, it doesn't show any correlation at all, because these data, that's Australia, and that's Western Europe. That's Western Europe. The only Western European country that doesn't lie on that horizontal edge is Portugal for some reason. But apart from that, all the Western European countries lie there, and there's absolutely no correlation at all. And here are all the Eastern European countries and the South American countries. Plus a few like Korea, a few of Hong Kong. And again, that's also an A showing absolutely no correlation at all. So that's actually a statistical fraud, virtually. I mean, that graph shows absolutely no relationship at all between asbestos consumption and mesothelioma rates. And the reason is, of course, because it isn't broken down by fibre type. And blue asbestos and brown asbestos were orders of magnitude more dangerous than the white asbestos in relation to causing mesothelioma. And so, I mean, this sort of thing is very bad science, but whether or not there's any point in pointing it out, I don't know. I'm pointing it out now, so perhaps I should have thought about it more carefully. I mean, this is an editorial that appeared in The Lancet soon afterwards, which when you read it sounds like mother and apple pie, but if you actually analyse it, it's a scientific scandal. Well, first of all, asbestos is a combination of naturally occurring minerals with two primary varieties, chrysotile and chrysidolite. Amosite isn't mentioned. It's the major cause of British mesothelioma, and that's one little detail. All forms of asbestos are carcinogenic. That's true, but I mean, there are very large differences between them. In the UK alone, 2,000 people a year are dying of asbestos exposure. A similar epidemic is likely to arise in developing countries where asbestos is still widely used. It isn't true. I mean, they're only using white asbestos. So it's a very odd, you know. Despite Canada's claims that chrysotile poses a lower health risk than other types of asbestos, I mean, that's a fairly reasonable phrase, isn't it? Despite Canada's claims that chrysotile, it does cause the sort of 50-fold lower risk. It's not Canada claiming it, it's a fact. It acknowledges that chrysotile is a carcinogen. Well, I mean, Richard Dodd published a paper in 1955 showing a relative risk of 10 for lung cancer in chrysotile workers who were working in the 20s. I mean, it's massively carcinogenic, and everybody knows it. And then the only way to eliminate asbestos-related disease is to stop the use of all types of asbestos. Well, I mean, that's true of all carcinogens. So there's no more diesel cars and no more, no more power stations and no more nickel. I mean, if the only thing to do with carcinogens is ban them, then civilization closes down. Now, in the case of asbestos, we know it's a good idea to ban it because we did it, and we suffered no disadvantages at all. I mean, we placed it, it stimulated the alternative fibre industry, and Britain hasn't suffered economically at all from banning it, so it's a good idea to ban it. But whether it's a good idea to campaign for Russia to ban it like this, or whether we should be more scientific about it, is an interesting question. And it's also an interesting question what Europe should do about it. As you know, I mean, there's a hysterical fuss about it and billions of pounds being spent to control it. And it really isn't clear that it's appropriate. I mean, the risks are an order of magnitude less than they were because the exposures, you know, what we're finding people's lungs is an order of magnitude less. And, I mean, at what point do you take a quantitative approach to risk-benefit analysis, or is all shroud waving the same as all other shroud waving? You know, I mean, HIV is worse than runny noses. And even more recently, I'm particularly sore about this at the moment because IARC is setting up this study, which I think is a jolly good idea, to find out what happens to Russian asbestos workers. And the Lancet launched a real campaign against IARC for doing a scientific study. And this is from this year in the Lancet. I mean, and it's the most extraordinary. I don't know. IARC is open to accusations that range from poor judgment to allegations of corporate capture by the asbestos industry. I mean, it would be nice for them to actually analyse the accusations and see whether they're true, not say that somebody accused them of it. A paper by an IARC scientist has been criticised for inaccurately downplaying the risks of asbestos and over-reliance on data from studies done in Quebec funded by the Canadian asbestos industry. All asbestos epidemiology in the 60s, 70s and 80s and 90s was funded by the asbestos industry, which Dodd and I were. We didn't get a penny out of it, but they paid for the staff to go and extract the personnel records. And that's what Corbett MacDonald did in Canada. I mean, it's the most extraordinary smear campaign, but it's in a good cause. So you see what I mean? I mean, it's a very interesting dilemma. And finally, IARC's collaboration in a study of Russian lifestyle miners has given rise to the gravest concerns within WHO and the most vehement criticism from outside the organisation. I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, it's scurrilous politics. But as I say, it's in a good cause, so maybe they're right. But I mean, it's interesting. I mean, asbestos is still interesting. It's less important than it used to be, but it's still interesting. What should we do about it? Anyway, these are the people who did all the work. Thank you.